As I said last week, it's relatively rare to have Epiphany fall on a Sunday. At a basic level, for someone relatively compulsive like I am, it's very satisfying to get the wise men all the way to the creche before we have to pack them all up and put them away for another year. Usually they're stuck kind of back by the tree on their way, and maybe they're up here on Wednesday, but this coinciding also has given me a chance to think a little more than usual about this particular part of the New Testament Christmas story. The stories about the birth of Jesus are found in Luke and in Matthew only. Mark doesn't have anything before the baptism of Jesus, and John begins with the more philosophical, in the beginning was the Word. But the two versions in Luke and in Matthew are pretty hard to reconcile with each other. They tell a different story. Usually what we do is use the Luke story as a kind of structure and then put in parts of Matthew as they fit into the flow. Luke has the shepherds and the heavenly chorus. He tells about Jesus' circumcision. He tells about the family going up to the temple in Jerusalem for the rite of purification shortly after Mary had given birth, and the greeting from some of the people there acknowledging the specialness of Jesus. Matthew doesn't have shepherds. He doesn't have the imperial registration, the census that was taken. He doesn't have the Annunciation or the Visitation, no purification in the temple with all its accompanying events. But it's only in Matthew that we get the wise men, and this story is usually geared to Epiphany. The Greek word that's translated as wise men is magi, and the magi, magus, is the singular, were an order of Zoroastrian priests from Persia, Mesopotamia, and that's the origin of the English word magic or magician. Their arrival at Mary and Joseph's house, and notice they go into the house. It's not a stable. And if you read the introductory part about their dialogue with Herod and determining the time of the birth, and then what Herod does later with the slaughter of the innocents, it could be up to 2 years after the birth. The wise men got there, and Matthew doesn't say there were 3 of them. He just says there were 3 gifts. So we read a lot into that story and making it into a nice pageant-worthy thing with a few jobs for baritones in it. I'd always use this particular story to point out what I saw as the absurdity of taking the Bible literally. I point out that stars are overwhelmingly huge objects in space. If you can even call them objects, they're energy balls that glow with constant thermonuclear reactions in their core, many, many, many times larger than the Earth. So they don't hover over buildings, whether they're staples or houses or whatever. They don't stop. But this time when I read it, it struck me how odd this story is in some ways. Where did it come from? Why is it there? How does it fit in? Matthew's main deal is He's preaching to Jewish Christians, writing for Jewish Christians, and he uses his material to draw parallels between Moses and Jesus. And you see that in a number of places, including in that whole slaughter of the innocents story and the flight down to Egypt. That's connected to Pharaoh killing the Jewish children so that they can come back out of Egypt. When Joseph and Mary and Jesus come back out of Egypt, they get that in Matthew is when they first go to Nazareth in a kind of, I guess, witness protection program. Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source, the gospel according to Mark, but there's no wise men in Mark. They both used a source that had the sayings of Jesus, which contained wisdom, but don't have wise men. And researching this time, I came across attempts by various interpreters to connect this story to things, for example, in the Old Testament. Luke is the one Luke does that a lot. Whenever he doesn't know something about Jesus, he looks up what it says in the Old Testament about the Messiah, and he writes that in as part of the biography of Jesus, because he knows Jesus was the Messiah. But Matthew didn't do that much. And so Matthew had heard this story from somewhere, but I don't think he understood it. I think that the people that find prophecies dealing with a star or dealing with kings or dealing with magi, Matthew doesn't say they're kings, but the connections like we have with the reading from Isaiah that we had for the first reading, I think those are post facto. I don't think Matthew did what Luke does in looking it up. I think that people read Matthew and then found the prophecies. Matthew just passed on, I think, a story he heard, but I don't think he passed it on as it originally was formed. The modern church, of course, doesn't deal with any of this because they just say, well, the wise men's story is a symbol of the Christian revelation extending beyond the Jewish community, a light to enlighten the Gentiles. And that's why it starts Epiphany, which that's the theme in a way of Epiphany, this showing forth. The word Epiphany means to show forth, to shine forth. But Matthew wasn't writing about that. He was writing about the connection to Judaism. He didn't care so much about the Gentiles. That the early church did. We hear that in the letter to the Ephesians, where they're talking about the inclusion of the Gentiles being so important. Paul cared about that, but not Matthew. The story isn't about really what the Magi gained from Bethlehem, a new faith or a conversion to Judaism or a sense of inclusion in chosen people or in the church. It's about what they gave. It was wise men bearing gifts. And their first gift was just to come there, right? To honor this child. And it's kind of strange for Zoroastrian priests to come from Persia and Mesopotamia to honor a Jewish child. As Zoroastrian priests, they represent a different religious focus than is found in the Hebrew tradition. They bring their own kind of spirituality into the story of Jesus. That's the part that I don't think Matthew picks up on. He tries to incorporate it into Judaism. The church tries to incorporate it into the expansion to the Gentiles. But something's going on here that includes the Christian revelation in a broader spirituality. The Jewish spirituality was centered on history. Persian and Mesopotamian spirituality is centered on the cosmos. The Magi were astrologers. They were astronomers. That's what Matthew confuses. When the story originally says the Magi say they saw his star rise, they're talking about an astrological occurrence, a conjunction in the heavens, or some precision of the equinoxes or something like that. I don't know it very well, but that was their mindset. They weren't talking about an actual star wandering someplace. But they were astrologers. Judaism placed the events of the sacred tradition in a historical context that went back 4,000 years, and you have all the begats to take account of those 4,000 years, albeit with some fairly long-lived people. But the Magi saw things in cosmic dimensions. They weren't concerned about history, and they weren't concerned about scientific factuality, objective data. That wasn't what the star portended. That's not what Jesus was all about. I don't believe in astrology as some kind of predictive technique. But I'm pretty convinced that the Magi didn't look at it that way either. I think that sort of astrological literalism, which you find sort of in New Agey stuff or in the newspaper horoscope, if they still run that, is just as off base as biblical literalism. It freezes something that's more spirited, less heavy, that's lighter, that's more airy, harder to get a hold of, into some fact, into some piece of data. This kind of literalism is a modern phenomenon over the last 300-400 years. It's what grounds our culture. It's what we used to think about truth and falsehood. But it's not what people thought about truth and falsehood before. Literalism is based on scientific methodology and objective rationalism. Spiritual thought, spiritual truth works symbolically and metaphorically, poetically. And where we see symbols and metaphors or poetry as somehow a little less real than objective facts, for this kind of spirituality, it's more real. It's more deeply profound. It calls us out of our isolated, ego-based, literal life to understand that we are connected beyond. And that was the point of the whole star system, is the Magi were saying it's all connected. It's all connected. And something's happening here in Bethlehem. It's not just bound within the law and the prophets. It's not just bound within the scientific curriculum. It's something true, but beyond the factual. The gifts that they brought, besides themselves, were gold and frankincense and myrrh, and these are also symbolic. The gold stood for perfection in the material realm. Not wealth so much as worth. Not something to be hoarded, but something to be used for good, for pleasure, for enjoyment. There was a spiritual value found in the material world, symbolized by this gift of gold that I've pointed out before, is one of the main points of Christianity. That the spiritual comes to us in the material world. It's not separate, not two different things. The frankincense spoke about the spiritual part. Frankincense is a gum resin that's harvested and processed from African trees, and then it was burned in temples or shrines in various spiritual traditions to carry prayers to heaven, and to bring heaven to the people praying. It was a material substance that's transformed into a buoyant spirituality. The container is burned away. The smoke dissipates, but that odor, that scent of holiness remains. I don't know whether you've been around churches that much, but it does have a special effect, besides the effect of making the congregation cough and the singers not be able to sing, which is why we don't do it so much. But it is special. It takes soul to spirit and gives spirit to soul. And for the Magi, Jesus is the fulcrum, the pivot point for that transition, the transition of material, everyday life into a spirituality, as we burn away what's unnecessary, as we let the smoke drift away, that scent of holiness remains for us, not substituting for life, but as a further dimension of life. And then there's the myrrh. Now you notice in the quote they found from Isaiah to back this up, it says gold and frankincense. It doesn't say anything about myrrh, which is why I think it doesn't jive really. Myrrh was used in embalming after death. So with this gift, death is present even here at the birth. Death, which the modern world tries to deny as much as possible, runs away from when it can't deny it, sees it as an enemy, is somehow essential to Epiphany, somehow essential to showing forth the death of Jesus, our own death, the realm of death, the process of death. As one of the prayers of our burial office puts it, death is the gateway to resurrection joy. So I don't know really. I've dismissed this story too long as a fiction. I still don't think Matthew fully understood the deeper meaning of it when he put it down in the story, but I think he got it better than we do with the kind of inherent mystical disabilities of our culture. So often we think that by reading this stuff in a literal way, we're showing respect somehow, or we're showing that we believe. But I think when we do that, we're boxing it up into this sort of churchy wrapping paper, and so we can put it on the shelf and bring it out like the wise men at the Christmas celebration for our use when it's convenient. And really, it's challenging us to look deeper than that, to look beyond the historical codification of our religious tradition in the Bible even, to look beyond to other traditions, to find within ourselves these elements that are not taken account of by our comfortable, civilized, scientific culture, and to open up to what God is doing in the world that may be beyond what we understand. I don't know. I plan to think more about this, and I invite you to do the same. Because there are many epiphanies coming our way, and we need to be ready to recognize them. Thanks be to God.